welcome to another at History Gems. What I wanted to talk to you about this time was a pattern that doesn't get talked about an awful lot. Now, I'm not a huge fan of patterns in history, as it starts presupposing a certain level of, well, this was always going to happen, and that's obviously not the case. But for 1,000 years, on 5 different occasions, so roughly every 200 years, something strange happened in Central Asia. A group of nomadic people who were excellent horsemen and knew how to use a composite bow to lethal effect would put aside their local tribal differences, band together, and attack the known world. Some of them would head west, some a little more easterly, but all of them would come into history. Now, to be clear, these weren't all the same people. Ethnically, linguistically, they were different, but they came from largely the same area and certainly had the same tactics. They came with many different names, depending on the region they were attacking at any given time, but in general, they were quite often referred to as the Devil's Horsemen. So let's start with round one, and one of the most famous of these horsemen, Attila the Hun, who in the late 5th century, that's the 400s, attacked the Western Roman Empire. And as you can see here from the picture, the empire was large indeed. And you can see the typical armour with the recurved bow and the horsemen. Next, about 3 centuries later, in the late 700s, early 800s, we have Charlemagne, who not only had to face the Vikings from the north, but coming in from the northeast, we have the Magyars. The Huns disappeared and became Hungary, but the people of Hungary today speak Magyar because of this new group of horsemen that came into town. The Huns and Hungarians are incredibly proud of their links to these two great warrior groups, but that didn't make Charlemagne's life any easier, as he had this new, highly mobile threat to deal with. Almost exactly 200 years later, and we get the Turks, or to be precise, the Seljuk Turks, the green area shown here. They are not the same as Arabs, and they were only recently converted to Islam, but again, you can see the general style of armour and armaments, and the cavalry was once again like the Huns and the Magyars. These group were of course to be around during the Crusades and were to be the bane of the heavy cavalry coming from Europe. But the fighting was thick and fierce, and another example of the viciousness of these people. However, the Turks and the West and China were to face the Mongols under Genghis Khan and his descendants. They were to build the largest land empire the world has ever seen, but their weapons and tactics were fundamentally the same as these previous groups. The final group were under Tamerlane, perhaps the less well-known of all these groups, but from the late 1300s to the early 1400s, he was to crash through Central Asia, taking places as far afield as Baghdad, Georgia, and Delhi. His group were the last great nomadic horsemen, and his descendants were to found the Mughal Empire of India. But Tamerlane was the final roll of the dice, nearly 1,000 years after Attila the Hun. We were to get new civilizations and new cultures like the Ottoman Empire, and the Russians were also finally able to hold back these horsemen under, starting with, Ivan the Terrible, but many other Tsars were to fight against these nomadic horsemen. The legacy of these people still lives on. As already mentioned, Hungary gets its name from the Huns. The Great Wall of China was finally completed to make sure that the Mongols wouldn't come in again any time soon. And we can see this generally as a sign that this more nomadic way of life was ultimately getting beaten by the efficiencies of a sedentary civilization that was based on things like trade, cities, and more professional armies as well. Technology certainly played its part too. So with that in mind, thank you for watching, and see you next time.
Thank you for watching. As always, I've got my books, everything from the Napoleonic Wars and 100 Facts up to Deus Vult, A Concise History of the Crusades. You can always find me on Facebook and indeed on Twitter as @HistoryGems with a G. Thank you for watching and see you soon.